Hello everyone. Today I'm going to start a new policy today. Today I'm going to start a new policy, that is national policy on housing. Brief about the national policy of housing, and this is also quite an important policy in the area of various where in the area of discussing various other policies. And we all know that housing, affordable housing schemes or housing is an important and essential need for any existence. And in fact, there had been a increased recognition in terms of health, housing and well-being of the people. And it is also believed that it is just not about providing shelter, but it is also provides a sense of security and safety. And it is shelter is also an entitlement of the citizen of any country. So in and the development of nation is revealed by the manner in which the basic needs, that is food, shelter, housing, clothing, livelihood, and all other are manifested across the society. And Article 21 of the Constitution of India guarantees the right to life to all its citizens. So the scope of this right has been expanded in resonance with various human rights treaties that emphasizes the overriding need to ensure, among other rights, the right to adequate shelter. Shelter is equally important part of anyone's existence. So it implies the right to food, water, hygiene, environment, medical care, shelter, and education, all woven into one basket of facilities that provide a quality life to all citizens and a habitat that facilitates dignified life with privacy and self-respect. India, with its predominantly rural populace dispersed over in villages with marginal to low levels of economic development, faces a unique challenge in the task of addressing adequate habitat for all. And the task is a multidimensional one, and has to specifically work in terms with the geoclimatic features, low level of disposable incomes of majority of the people, technological and information gaps, as well as inadequate privacy mechanisms and management capacities. So, the strategy of a rural housing and habitat policy would have to be sustainable in lieu of the various factors which I've just mentioned, leveraging the inherent potential of the rural society. It would have to empower rural communities in order to manage the development of the habitat and owns the assets created. So, since we have, it was believed that the private enterprise alone would not be able to provide, or rather the private sectors without the direct investment of the government cannot solve the housing sanity situation of the world. And India also, there was a steady urban growth and urban population since 1921. The population grew to 21% to 31% and 54% during the 1921, 31, 1931 and 41 and 1941 to 51 census period respectively. There was a tremendous rise in the population, particularly post-independence phase. The main reason identified behind this growth of urban population was the growth of heavy industries, industrial setup, and building of war partition and building of war production, plants in urban areas of the country, people migrating from rural to urban areas for better opportunities and for better prospects, and for having a more equitable and balanced, to have a more, accessibility to healthcare and better healthcare facilities, or education facilities. Further, since the partition of the country, there was a very high influx of refugees also who tried to settle in the urban areas. So the supply of housing, on the other hand, did not keep pace with the increasing demand for housing facilities. Private enterprise, which was the sole agent of building activities till independence, tended to shrink on account of scarcity and high price of building materials during and immediately after the Second World War. So additionally, it was observed that the rents had been generally high, but during and after the Second World War, landlords began to realize rent at much higher rates, sometimes wholly out of the proportion to the capital outlay. So various state governments attempted to control rents and avoid eviction of tenants by means of these special legislations. Uh, then there has always been a need for housing policy because of, just now I have mentioned two important factors. First, there was this partition, influx of the refugees, and secondly, because of the industrial setup and heavy industries came into existence, the population expanded exponentially. So the need for housing policy and the need for a housing and habitat policy emerges from the responsibility of the state to ensure that every citizen has a safe, secure, and healthy place to live and work and lead a life of dignity. It also emerges from the pressing need to enhance quality of life as well as opportunities of growth in rural areas. It was estimated by the UN in 1999 that the average annual rate of increase in rural population would decline from 0 to 82% during 2000-2005 to 0.40% during 2025-30. So this is indicative of the scale of migration from rural to urban areas in the country. At present, effectively over 80% of rural houses do not have adequate livelihood and stable livelihood options. So housing, besides being a very basic requirement for human beings, it also holds the key to accelerate the pace of development. Investment in housing has a very high multiplier effect on income and employment. It is estimated that overall employment generation in the economy due to additional investment in the housing construction is 8 times the direct employment. So the magnitude of housing demand is extremely, it's high, and it is linked to the pattern of economic and demographic growth, settlement status, and overall shelter quality. In fact, according to the Census of India 2001, rural areas account for 71% of the population and about 65% of the housing shortage in the country. Of the 71% of the rural population in India, only 41% of the total rural population lives in Pakka or permanent house, lived in Pakka house, and about 78% of rural houses have some access to some source of water, while less than 23% have access to sanitation. So this data underscores the need for a holistic approach of habitat development encompassing adequate housing, livelihood infrastructure, sanitation facilities, and water supply. History of housing policy. If you look into the historical aspect, the housing is an important sector of economy, and the provision of it is largely determined by state policy and intervention. So the economic importance of housing calls for cautious policy framework so that it does not hamper the growth, and after continuing with the housing policy dominated by the state's housing provisions through various policies and programs, it moved towards enabling the provision of housing with the advent of new economic policy and unveiled in the early 90s. Although a private sector has a larger role to play, the state has to play the role of provider of social housing for the poor and ensure that the regulatory environment enables and ensures appropriate levels of housing. Housing, which is considered to be an economic good, is an important economic good in the consumption basket. Therefore, as it relates to the survival of human beings, and it is tied to security as well as safety and protection. Therefore, an improvement in housing facilities or housing status leads to development of the household in true sense, both economic and social. And moreover, housing activity is tied with many other sectors of economy as well, as a life stage of individual, his social network. Improvement in housing on both qualitative as well as quantitative parameters leads to an increased welfare for the individual and the society by not only providing the vital shelter but also offering room for improved health, education, and nutrition. So, these characteristics of housing have paved or prompted several governments to undertake the responsibility of housing provisions, which India has also undertaken for almost 40 50 years after independence. So, with changing, with changing political and economic structure of nations and changing notions and changing priorities of development policy, the focus and intervention of government in the provision of housing have also been changing, primarily shifting away from greater public provision to greater market provision. And this role shift was in fact this role shift was in fact suggested by the World Bank more than 2 decades ago, but stronger emphasis on policy changes and enabling environment came forth only a decade ago, with a more recent phenomena. Then housing policies of the government of India have come a long way since 1950s. While at the start of the planned development, the policies were more welfare centric. Later on, these came to be driven by a defined constellation of economic interests. At the same time, the role of the government has also changed gradually from being a provider of housing to being merely a facilitator of housing activity. For an easy understanding, it divides the periods since 1950s into four phases. The first phase roughly emphasizes of the first 2 decades when the initial policies were taking shape and the government was trying to address the problem of all sections of society. The second phase is roughly between the period from early 1970s to mid 1980s. In this period, the government accepted that it cannot serve all the sections of the society and hence started focusing only on weaker sections. The third phase is roughly the period from the mid 1980s to 2000 to early 2000s, and this period was a neoliberal phase. Neoliberal policies made their way into the discourse, and it focuses to change from physical provision of housing to its financing. And then the last phase refers to the last 10-12 years, and in this period the government has definitely adopted the role of facilitator. It is now promoting the participation of private sector in housing activities for all the sections of society, while itself taking a back seat in all these activities. So, even the 5-year plans had assumed government as a central actor for provisioning welfare goods and controlling economic activities. So, the plan identified that owing to the industrialization and creation of new urban centers, there had been a large scale, and also there had been large scale migration from rural to urban areas in search of a better quality of life and employment. So, this migration has led to the growth of substandard houses and slums containing insanitary mud huts of flimsy construction, poorly ventilated, over congested, and often lacking in essential amenities. This was a major concern when with this growing migration and growing population which has migrated from rural to urban areas. I will discuss about the various housing policies under the 5-year plans umbrella, and the 5-year plans has always had certain since the inception of Planning Commission, 5-year plans were formulated in order to accelerate the economic growth of the nation, as well as to look after the welfare needs, to provide basic necessities and basic requirements of the larger population, to provide them that security and safety as a nation. In fact, the first 5-year plan dedicated 33% of its total expenditure in housing, building on the principle that it is not possible for the private enterprise by itself to meet the housing expenditure of the lower income groups. So, the policymakers and planners, they identified the housing needs of the most vulnerable sections of the society and created targeted housing policies for industrial workers, dock workers, plantation workers, low income income groups are providing direct subsidy to the identified groups. To provide housing for migrant population from Pakistan, model towns were also established, and in the cities of Gujarat, Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, Punjab, and Chandigarh, housing colonies were built for the people from West Pakistan and West Bengal, for people from East Pakistan, further enhancing the rental housing supply in the new urban centers. Rent Control Act 1961 was rolled out, and further central government organizations like the railways, posts and telegraph department, defense, they built accommodation for their employees. Similarly, state government undertakings built accommodations for their employees. Additionally, the housing policy laid down by the first 5-year plan highlighted the need for cooperatives to ensure a supply of middle income group housing. The 1950s and 1960s emerged as a major period of institutional development across the country, and housing boards were established in various states with a mandate to administer the central housing funds, activate housing programs, and to administer construction of houses for the public. The Ministry of Works and Supply also was expanded to the Ministry of Works, Housing and Supply in 1952 with a mandate to eradicate urban poverty, provide housing and run employment programs. In 1954, the National Building Organizations was created under the Ministry of Works, Housing and Supply with a mandate for technology transfer, experimentation, development and dissemination of housing statistics. With the birth of town and country planning organizations and with the merger of the erstwhile Town Planning Commission and Central Regional and Urban Planning organizations in 1962, policymakers recognized that the availability of sufficient and affordable land was central to the success of all housing schemes, and emphasis was placed on the preparation of master plans and regional plans for different categories of urban areas. Then the third five, these were the first two plans which had spoken about, how for housing schemes and housing facilities would be taken into consideration. So the first two plans had concentrated on providing affordable housing facilities, or rather building houses. In fact, even it was being said that not only the private sectors could not manage to build houses, so the role of the government was equally important. There were various industries and dock workers. They have been constructing houses on their own to provide housing facilities to the middle income group and to the most vulnerable sections of the population. Now, the third 5-year plan recognized the growth of population in urban areas required at least three general consideration in relation to which the direction of housing programs should be developed in the subsequent 5-year plans. So the first, it recognized that housing policies need to be set in the larger context of economic development and industrialization. It called for a cohesive decision between location and dispersal of industries and the housing problem. Secondly, the plan called also for a coordinated effort between all agencies concerned, whether public, cooperative or private. And thirdly, the entire program of housing construction was to be so oriented that it serves specially the requirements of the low income groups with the community. And by 1968, almost all the state has introduced town planning legislations with varying scopes provision, which made in this state sector for urban development, housing and metropolitan schemes. To supplement these resources, a provision of rupees 10 crore was made in the fourth 5-year plan for establishment of a housing and urban development corporation, popularly known as HUDCO. It was expected that HUDCO will build up a revolving fund of rupees 200 crores through governmental allocations, mobilization of private savings and support from appropriate international agencies. Loan were to be provided to the respective state governments from this revolving fund to finance projects of housing and urban development. The fifth plan viewed slum upgrading as the solution to housing problems, and thus in situ slum upgradation assumed the central stage. The approach gave birth to schemes like environment improvement of urban slums and sites and service scheme. The aim behind these schemes was that the beneficiaries themselves will gradually improve the quality of accommodation in due course of time. Then the sixth five-year plan saw a reduction in the provision of direct subsidies for urban housing. It recommended provisions of subsidies in the form of infrastructural and sanitation facilities, which were aimed at improving the environment for people, along with the provision of stimulus and support to private housing to channelize savings into housing construction sector. In fact, there was a recognition for modification of existing building bylaws, land use controls, minimum plot requirements, and land requirements for roads, which were viewed as hindrance in attempting to reduce the cost of dwelling units. Further, housing was beginning to be recognized as an economic activity that generated employment. The seventh plan established that the government has to play an active role through developing the necessary delivery systems in the form of housing finance market, and taking steps to make developed land available at right places and at reasonable prices. So it was further envisaged that the public sector should not engage in direct house construction except in the case of weaker sections of the society. And in fact, the seventh plan had recognized housing as a main amenity to uplift the standard of living of the population in the Indian cities. In fact, housing was meant to fulfill fundamental objectives of the plan, providing shelter, raising the quality of life, creating conditions which are conducive to the achievement of crucial objectives in terms of health, sanitation, and education. They were creating employment and dispersed economic activity, improving interpersonal equity, and generating voluntary savings. This era also saw emphasis. This era saw emphasis in need to invest in small and medium towns through integrated development of small and medium towns, making a point that decentralization of urban growth was necessary. In the seventh plan document, there was also a growing concern over the need of devolution of funds and power to the urban local bodies for the revitalization of civic bodies and to increase community-centric participation. And it also aimed at enhanced private initiative and investment in urban development. The era recognized the government funds were limited, and thus ULBs, urban local bodies, with the help of the private sector, must mobilize additional resources. So it was during this period that urban local bodies received a constitutional status by 74th Amendment Act of 1992. And within the backdrop of the seventh plan, the National Housing Policy in 1998 was launched and came into existence. Then 1992 and 2005, although the housing policy which was made in 1988, it was being revised in 1992 and came into existence in 1994. So 1992, between 1992 and 2005, had started with the liberalization of housing policies. In fact, under this era, the eighth plan envisaged shelter for all on a self-sustaining basis and recognize the need of different state intervention for the provision of housing to the vulnerable sections of the population. It further recognized that the state intervention in housing, which started as a welfare activity, is now recognized as a social and economic imperative. The eighth plan estimated that during the period of the seventh plan, 7.14 lakh EWS and 1.67 lakh LIG dwelling units were constructed, and 2.3 lakh dwellings units were constructed under cooperative housing schemes, and subsidy and loan was provided for the construction of 5.73 lakh dwelling units. Further, the night shelter scheme benefited around 26,000 pavement dwellers. The eighth plan also laid substantial emphasis on saving construction costs through promotion of low cost and innovative building materials and technology, as building materials account for a major part of the total cost of the construction. This led to the establishment of Building Materials and Technology Promotion Council in the year 1990. So, nation building organizations also undertook experimental housing projects in different geoclimatic regions of the country, and developed appropriate design and safety nets measures and safety measures in zones prone to landslides. As a part of centrally sponsored scheme, a network of over 200 building centers were established across the country to impart training to artisans in low cost skills and construction skills, and produce building material and components by utilizing agro-industrial waste. Now, this era of 1992 and between 2005, as I was saying, that it was a liberalization of housing policy. The era began the structural adjustment programs leading to globalization and liberalization of economy. There was a growing recognition of the role and importance of the urban centers for the growth of national economy. Housing deficit was identified to be a byproduct of exponentially increasing land and construction costs and deteriorating quality of life in urban pockets. An important, development in the eighth plan was bringing about of a consensus in the approach to human settlement development. In relation with the urban habitat space, this era provoked a thought process on structural reshaping of the land market to answer the shelter problem. Amidst argument related to rising land prices and rents in Indian cities, the Urban Land Ceiling and Regulation Act was replaced in many states, inviting FDI investment by non-resident Indians in the land market, especially of metros like Delhi and Mumbai. The Rent Control Act too was altered with the premise to increase investment in rental housing and to blame the interests of both the tenants and the owners. The ninth plan also highlighted, the ninth plan, the ninth plan came into existence, and it was during this plan period that National Slum Development Policy was highlighted through the introduction of in situ slum rehabilitation policies. The ninth plan also highlighted the agenda of upgradation and renewal of old and dilapidated housing stock, which form a major part of the old city crores in Indian cities. So it was recognized that steps in this direction are crucial to improve overall health and sustainability of this urban environment. Minimum adequacy standards were beginning to be emphasized in this era. The ninth plan aiming to set minimum housing adequacy, norms that would include per capita living space, structural durability, access to drinking water with minimum quantitative and qualitative norm, sanitation facilities and connectivity at the level of ULB. So the National Housing and Habitat Policy 1998, with an aim to provide shelter to all, especially to the poor and deprived, set a target of construction of 20 lakh houses per year, out of which 7 lakh were to be in the urban area. And since I was saying that this plan had also took significance of the National Slum Development Policy and highlighted through the introduction of in situ slum rehabilitation policies like Valmiki Ambedkar Awas Yojana, which was launched in 2001 for ameliorating the conditions of the urban slum dwellers living below poverty line. It was emphasized that decentralization would benefit the slum development programs at the city level, and the focus was to benefit the slum dwellers and provide them with an increased opportunity to articulate their needs and obtain increased assistance from civic authorities and planner. It was expected out of ULB that the livelihood mission Swarn Jayanti Shahri Rozgar Yojana would be enacted in coherence with the housing policies by increasing the participation of urban poor in the implementation and designing of the projects and service delivery. The era was a step forward in the role of the government from making need-based policies to demand-based policies, and the role of the government was limited to being that of a facilitator, and it was on the onus of the individual to improve her housing conditions. In fact, the idea of social housing as envisaged during the first plan was now drifting towards affordable housing, and there were attempts to enhance the demand for housing through livelihood missions, emphasis on project based planning, increasing finance accessibility. The new program introduced were closer to the perception of the need of the urban poor. For example, the in situ slum rehabilitation focus through VAMBE, that was Valmiki Ambedkar Awas Yojana, aimed to address the need of the urban poor, but in effect address the planners' perception of need, as the parameters remained the same for all the projects. Then the number of the urban conglomeration in India had increased from 2,768 in 1991 to 5,161 in 2000, and since the time was seen apt for India to launch its national urbanization policy, which focused on large-scale urban infrastructure, laid base for Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission. The primary objective of the urbanization policy was to achieve sustainable development by reducing spatial disparities, and the policy envisaged a strengthening of the urban local bodies through capacity building and financial management. It also aimed to increase the efficiency and productivity of cities by deregulation and development of land, dismantling public sector a monopoly over urban infrastructure, and creating a conducive environment for the private sector to invest. The era also began with the recognition that progress is affordable, progress in affordable housing has been hampered by the unavailability of suitable land for in situ slum rehabilitation, and the scarcity of land is the result of suboptimal land use patterns, largely induced by the regulatory regime in place, lack of long-term planning, and lack of participatory planning process to determine the most efficient use of a parcel of land. It was recognized that the huge investments required to bridge the gap between demand for affordable housing and its availability cannot be met alone by the government, and hence the key would be to increase beneficiaries' contribution as well as private investment. So the focus of the program was towards increasing the paying capacity of the urban poor in order to make housing affordable by increasing their access to institutional credit or encouraging them to organize in self-help groups. These measures were able to were to enable the beneficiary to incrementally improve her living conditions or rent a shelter, and for this the government launched the Rajiv Awas Yojana, a flagship program for in situ slum rehabilitation centered around community participation and beneficiary involvement. The urban housing formed a minor part of JNNURM as it was not acknowledged as part of urban infrastructure. However, JNNURM constituted of two housing missions, namely BSUP, that is a basic services for urban poor, concentrating on larger cities, and IHSDP, that was integrated housing and slum development program for small and medium towns. So the reforms aimed through JNNURM were to work on these certain principles. First, urban poor should be enabled to have access to land and not squeeze out of the urban land market in the face of skyrocketing land prices. A dedicated budget be created at the city as well as state level to ensure a steady flow of resources for urban poverty alleviation, and slum upgradation, including provision of land and housing to the poor. And thirdly, basic services have to be provided to the urban poor based on agreed milestones and deliberately planned efforts to develop inclusive cities. The 10th five-year plan, however, envisages strengthening the vulnerable houses in EWS and LIG housing. The National Habitat Policy in 2007 was announced in December 2007, taking into account emerging challenges of required shelter and growth of slums. And the first ever urban area was specified. Public-private art partnerships were brought into the urban agenda. And the 11th and 12th plan suggested multiple ways in which the availability of lands can be enhanced and the use of land can be optimized to maximum, that is increasing the SI and ground coverage. That was right now I will end my lecture talking about gave you a glimpse about the housing initiatives taken in the 5-year plans. In my next lecture, I will continue talking about the various national housing policy. Thank you.